one choice isn't right. Choice isn't right. Choice isn't right.
Disability as individual impairment is so deeply ingrained in everybody's consciousness, so it takes a while to dislodge it. But I think that I was always aware, even from sort of early diagnosis at the age of 14, that things weren't quite right. And that, I mean, I had disability, I had impairment in my family, and so I was already aware of barriers, I was already aware of the way that people got treated if they didn't fit a certain mould or a certain norm. And then when I became ill and then got diagnosed, and after a while it became clear that it was an impairment that was lifelong, I already had, I think, some kind of a politicised outlook. I think, for a very long time had an awareness of injustice, of the way of social exclusion, of inequality. I mean, it's interesting because obviously when you have an impairment that needs medical intervention, that it needs, you know, you've got to have surgery and all those things, you even begin to realise that although those things are helpful and they can be good, how badly you can get treated when you're in hospital and when you're treated as an object and as a bit of a nobody rather than with any kind of respect a lot of the time. But I think the time it clicked into place was when I met other disabled people, and I think that's inevitable. It's what makes me a little bit sad now about the way in which the opportunities for young disabled people to meet other disabled people in a political sense has dissipated. It's gone. It doesn't exist in the same way. You know, we don't have the disability arts events, the cultural events. We don't have political activities or activism to nearly the same extent. And I think that's a huge gap, because actually when you start to connect with other people and it becomes really clear that even though you might have very different impairments, that your experience is very similar. And so yeah, for me it was just meeting other people and everything, and really realising this is, you know, I've come home, these are the people that are like family, I can connect with them, and they're the people that will support me when I need it. I remember getting an early consciousness when I was doing youth work in the 1980s in Hackney, and there was a conference that was advertised, and it got brought to my attention, and it was by I think it was SPOD, which, if anybody remembers that, Ian Stanton used to satirise SPOD. It was like an organisation for disabled potatoes, but it was sexual and personal relationships of disabled people, and it became clear that it was just this really unpleasant, voyeuristic load of nasty people mainly, that but anyway, they were holding this conference, and I thought, I want to check this out, and I persuaded work to let me go. And that's where I met Chrissy Wilson and Michelin. They were there. And of course, all of us, it was so dreadful. The conference was so bad. And they had all these people talking about us and in the most appalling terms. And so we sort of gravitated towards each other fairly quickly over meal times, and really had a bit of a rebellion against the conference. That event and that conference, it became really clear about the real grip that the professionals had on our lives, and how they'd styled themselves as experts and completely dismissed us as having any kind of expertise. We stood up and we spoke against what was going on within the conference. We boycotted the big events. Yeah, it was important to do that. And I think it sort of kick-started a whole load of other stuff and getting involved in different organisations of disabled people. And of course it was just good timing, because it was at the time when disabled people's movement was really getting going. I mean, I remember the demonstration. I started to go on demos, and we had the big demonstration that went through London to Stockwell Park, and then there was the impromptu sit down. We just sat down at the Elephant and Castle roundabout, and Simon Brissenden wrote a great poem about it called "The Battle of the Elephant and Castle," but it was just, people were, you could tell that people were angry when BCODP came along. You know, I had some involvement with that, and I did a lot of community-based stuff and a lot of campaigning. So during that time, I started to be involved. We had a campaign locally that involved a lot of black disabled people, and it was called the Angela Whitelock Action Group. And there was a young black woman that lived in Hackney. She'd got a spinal injury when she was 16 and spent a year and a half, 2 years in hospital having rehabilitation, but also she got stuck there because there was nowhere for her to go. She had nowhere accessible to move to. And I was working in Hackney and living in Hackney, and the borough just wasn't doing anything, and I started to advocate on her behalf and realised how frustrating and fruitless it was because they didn't care. And so we set up this big campaign to get Angela rehoused, and it was about, it was about her, but it became about more than that. It became about the whole situation of disabled people not having accessible housing. And we did get Angela good accommodation. She got a really, really nice apartment, in a converted Victorian house that had all the access features that she needed for somebody who was a young woman using a wheelchair. Disability arts, I think, was sort of, the germs of it. It germinated around about the mid-1980s, and I think London Disability Arts Forum was round about that time that it got going, and I did become involved in London Disability Arts Forum. And also, it was great because we used to have regular events called the Workhouse, which was a disability arts cabaret. And it was the most eclectic bunch of people you've ever seen. It was, you'd have kind of people making music, like Kate Porter playing guitar and singing, and then you'd have Maudie and Harry playing the spoons. As long as they were disabled people, they could get up on stage and do their thing. And it was through the Workhouse that I started performing, and it was the first ever stand-up gig that I did. There had been a fairly sort of small but reasonably active campaign for accessible transport, CAT, and I hadn't really been involved in that, partly because they were small, and I don't think they, it might be me maligning them, but I don't think they were that great at building any kind of a base. It was the people that did it, and that was that. But I think the direct action, we did direct action with the Angela Whitelock group. We did, we stormed into the housing committee meeting at Hackney Town Hall, and we wouldn't leave until they spoke to us, and they said to us, look, we don't discuss individual cases. And we said, well, you do now. and it was, and because there was a large presence and a lot of the sort of local black community, it had a real impact. And I think that it's one of the reasons we succeeded, because it had community support. In 1990, I also formed a relationship with Johnny Crescendo or Alan Holdsworth, and he was living in Derbyshire, and there was a very active Derbyshire coalition, and they started to take actions, and it was around little local issues that affected people, like, the council closed off the parking for disabled people in the town. They decided to pedestrianise it, but removed all the parking for people using blue badges. And they said, no, we're not having it. And there was people like Ken and Maggie Davis there that were, of course, crucial to the disabled people's movement. We'd already started demonstrating against children in need. And again, that was a fairly sort of spontaneous, this is dreadful. And the focus at that time in the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, was very much on disabled kids and the tragedy of their lives. And so we'd had a couple of demos. We'd had one in Leeds. Again, there was a really good group in Leeds that got things going. There was Jill Crawshaw. There was also a guy called Mick Ward, who's a non-disabled person but an amazing ally. And I got to know them through some training I did up there. And then we decided that we were going to have a demonstration against the telethon, and it started with some young disabled people from Ealing, and they had a youth worker called Anna who was working with them, and they said to her, another telethon's coming up and it's going to be grim and excruciating, and what can we do? What can we do to, we can't just let it pass yet again. So we said, well, what do you want to do? We can try and organise a demo. And it was at quite short notice, but we did it. And we managed to get a couple of hundred people to the 1990 demo. And, you fall into the role of leadership because somebody needs to lead it. It's not going to happen spontaneously. Somebody needs to make the calls, somebody needs to write the press releases, speak to the press, do all of that kind of stuff. So we did it. We and we involved the young people, and they were really up for it. And they got bodies on the demo as well, which was great. We need to do this again, but much bigger and much better, and with much greater power. And that's what we achieved. But we were organising 6 months in advance, and we were also, I think, we generated enough interest with the press, and I think partly they were intrigued and also slightly appalled that we were campaigning against charity, which is what BCODP was doing at that time. I mean, we both know that the slogan of the time was "Rights Not Charity," and we were very actively opposed to the disability charities, none of which, the main impairment-based charities, they just weren't. They weren't run by disabled people. They didn't even employ disabled people. They just had these big organisations that provided well-paid jobs for a bunch of non-disabled people. And so, we wanted to really lay into the idea that charity was the solution for disabled people, and that there needed to, that it was actually a government responsibility, and that disabled people, this is round about that time, I think, that the Nothing About Us Without Us idea started to really take hold, and that disabled people had to be central to what was going on. And we got, 1,200, 1,500, possibly even 2,000 disabled people there. What I do know is the TV studio is on the road leading up to South Bank in central London, and we just blocked that entire road. It's called Upper Ground. We just blocked it. And so the police were trying to get these like Mercedes and Daimlers and things through, with people like Frank Bruno and Chris Tarrant and all these, B-list celebrities kind of coming along to do the telethon, and we were blocking them. We were actually blocking them, and it was one of the most powerful things I think we've done. And because we got so many people along, we did collect names and contact information, and that was where DAN, the Disabled People's Direct Action Network, began, because we thought, having done a really successful demo, and I've got to say it was successful because it was the last ever telethon, it never happened again after that, and I really believe that it was in large part due to our opposition to it. We went down to the Disabled Drivers Association place in Norfolk, and we just spent the weekend talking about how it would work, what we wanted, and what it meant. And in the meantime, me and Alan had gone to the States and made connections with ADAPT, which is the direct action group over there, and went on a couple of their actions and learnt a lot, because they're really fierce over there. I mean, they just basically sit in doorways and do not move. And they crash into the governor's offices, state governors. They go down there, and also they tail them. They just follow them around for days on end until they get answers. They're always there. They're always present, and I think that it built as a really powerful movement. They had successfully campaigned to get accessible transport, because that's how they started, and then they moved on to making sure that resources were put into enabling people to live in the community. If a disabled person was deemed to be too expensive to live in the community, they call it warehousing, and I think that's a good term. They just warehouse them into institutions. And also the system was very corrupt, because a lot of the medical practitioners that would recommend a disabled person goes into an institution, you'd find out, they did their research, they'd find out that they actually had financial interests in those very same nursing homes. Yeah, so they, their slogans was up with attendant care, down with nursing homes, and just and they're still campaigning around that. I mean, that's a long term campaign, and they've made some gains, but we know that you make gains, and then unless you're very vigilant, you lose them again. You can't sit back and say, yeah, all right, we've done it, we've achieved that, because depending on who's in government, and both in the States and here, we've just had horrific governments that whose approach to disabled people has been frightening. And I mean, I am going to say, I think one of the problems we have at the moment is that I don't think we have made nearly a robust enough response to the government's treatment of disabled people in the last 5 to 9 years. Well, since they got into power, really, the last, the Condems and now the Tories, is that I despair slightly that all people are hurting individually and people are being really oppressed individually, but that isn't translating into any kind of coherent action.
Well, we had the Disabled People Against the Cuts, and I suppose they've done some direct
I think DPAC has been a good thing, but I don't think it's broad-based enough. I think it needs to be bigger and better organised, and I don't think they're doing that. We always called it a network, so it's Disabled People's Direct Action Network, and we needed it to be as loose as that, because we didn't want it to be an organisation and start applying for funding and stuff. And I think one of the strengths of Dan always was that we didn't get funding from anywhere apart from individual donations. And where people could donate, they did. And a lot of the, basically me and Johnny put in half our salary, like what we were earning. A lot of it went into kind of keeping Dan afloat, and other people were putting their money in as well. It was successful for a time because we weren't dependent on anybody. We didn't have to be anybody else's conditions. And what we knew is that we would be breaking the law, because we decided that it would be a network of people who would engage in civil disobedience. And also at the first event where we got together, we had to become clear that we would have a specific issue that we campaigned on, and that became accessible transport. And although there was CAT, we thought, well, we can work together. We won't have to, there's no conflict of interests here. We just need to ramp up the campaign. And the other thing about Dan, because it was national and there was people from all over the country, with CAT, the actions just tended to be in London. Everything was in London, because it was a group of people that were London-based. Whereas with Dan, we did actions everywhere. We went, we were in Derby, we were in Nottingham, we were in Bristol, Birmingham, lots of different cities. Cardiff, we definitely went to Cardiff, wherever there were activists, Dan went. Like Dan groups or chapters, there were people organised in different parts. And so we had the national actions, and we had 2 national actions a year. in different cities, but we also started to respond to local issues, and we would also organise local actions, and that was one of the strengths as well, because people would go along and do direct actions, and sometimes some of us would go down to them. So there was and we had snap actions, which was the other thing. An issue would come up, and if we could, we would respond to it, and we could usually pull together enough people to have a snap action in 2-3 days. And that was the strength of having the network. That was the era when there were a lot of different private members' bills to bring about, to try and bring about some kind of law, civil rights law for disabled people. And so there was the Disabled People's Civil Rights Bill and all these different things. And of course the Tories repeatedly voted them down, and he was one of the people, the guy in Christchurch, that voted it down, were one of the attempts. And so people went down there to say, first of all, you can't do that, and secondly, you're a hypocrite. Yeah. And each time, I think the other fun part of Dan is that we always had T-shirts made for each of the actions. And every time we did another action, we'd add the place we'd been to the sleeve of the T-shirt. So by the time we'd been going for several years, we had 2 full sleeves of place names. So we had training events, we had training meetings, we used to try and make sure that people were talking to each other. A lot of the time is, the thing was set up really when there was no social media, and mostly people didn't really have computers or laptops. It was still early 1990s, up until I think we went throughout the 90s was our era, really. And so it was very much telephone, fax, and getting together. And we started to use email after a while, because then that started to happen. But of course, like I said, not everybody was connected in that way. And also, now you can't imagine a world without broadband, but then it was dial-up connection and it was really crappy. We had a group of organisers, and so the organisers got together frequently to organise the next action and to make decisions. Because a lot of what Dan did was very much, certainly at the actions, based on trust. It's you couldn't let too many people know what your tactics were going to be, because if you did, then the police would find out and it'd all get blown. Because every organisation or every grouping of that nature has, there's usually some form of infiltration. It might be a bit grandiose to suggest that we were infiltrated, but I certainly think that there will have been people that one way or another were either leaking information or prepared to leak information. So we had to really keep what we were doing under wraps. And it was only at the last minute that you'd say, you go there, and this is what we're doing now. And people just have to do it. And so that was the core sort of leadership.
A command structure.
It had to be. It had to be. ADAPT is very much like that. And it had to be for us as well. The more you let out into sort of wider groups of people, the more it would be likely that the action itself would be scuppered. If we screwed it up, if we got it wrong, we had to acknowledge that we got it wrong and what else we might have been able to do. You're always learning. You had to keep learning. And for me, part of leadership is about recognising that you're not always going to get it right. You've got to admit when you haven't, and you've got to acknowledge that you're learning as much as other people, but that when you do get it right, you keep hold of that and make sure that gets built on. It was 12 to 1500 for the telethon, 92 telethon demo. I'd say that we had, because we had so many different groups around the UK, it was over 1,000. We could bring together 50 or 80 people if we pushed it really hard for a snap action, a sudden action to respond to something. It became harder to bring people to national actions because it was expensive. We had to book hotels, and people needed to pay their fares to get to the places and whatever. Got rid of the telethon, that was the first thing. We achieved accessible transport, and you know, they'd been, like, the transport providers had been talking. I'd sat in meetings with them, and so had other people, and they'd been talking about the schedule for making transport accessible, and they just weren't doing it. They weren't doing it, and nobody was forcing the issue. You know, because BCODP were in those meetings. I mean, there was always somebody having those conversations, but they weren't yielding results, or at least not fast enough. You know, it's all very well saying, you know, we'll make buses accessible in 7 years or 10 years. We're saying, yeah, but I need to get on the bus tomorrow or next week. I can't wait for 10 years. One of our snap actions that we did, one of our local actions, Jeremy Corbyn came along, because it was in his constituency. It was at a local Odeon, at the Holloway Odeon. And a bunch of young people got ejected from there. They'd been going there for like 2 years or something. It was a youth group. And that's when a guy called Andy Gill became involved, because he was a youth worker there. And one week they turned up, there's a new manager who said, too many of you, you're fire risk, go away, I'm not letting you in. And so they got in touch and we said, okay, let's set something up. And so we went along on a Monday evening. We got enough people, including the young people, to encircle the cinema, block all the doors, handed out flyers to people saying, please don't go in, because they wouldn't allow. And, you know, people were genuinely shocked, like members of the public. And they were genuinely shocked, one, that the young people were not allowed access into the cinema, but also they'd been chucked out, having been allowed in there before. And so they didn't go in, and so nobody went in the cinema that night. And they lost all their revenue, and you know, that happened repeatedly in different places. There was a cafe in Camden Town that did the same thing, and again, nobody crossed our picket line, and they lost their revenue. And what we said to the cinema is, it's a Monday, next time it'll be a Saturday. So think about that, you know. And before we knew it, we were having meetings with senior people from what was then the Rank organisation, who ran the Odeon cinema chain. And I think the other big achievement that we certainly contributed towards, I wouldn't say it was all direct action, but was to finally make that final push on anti-discrimination legislation. Now, we ended up with the Disability Discrimination Act, which, as we all know, was a massive disappointment. But certainly in the first 2 to 4 years of having the Disability Discrimination Act, loads and loads of people used it to take action against their employers, because it was harder to do it in goods and services, but there were so many cases. People together made a bunch of placards, and we decided to do a very visual protest, which involved throwing red paint. And it was a fun one, because, you know, people turned up with these like sandwich boxes and little takeaway containers in their laps, looking like they were going to have a little sandwich lunch. And then at the moment, you know, when they were told, they just all flung the red paint at the gates of Downing Street. And yeah, so, and it went everywhere, I mean, absolutely everywhere. And it was, that image had a huge impact, and it went around the world. I mean, it was, you know, I found out that it was on the front page of a Japanese newspaper, and you know, certainly in the States and everywhere. So yeah, it had a big impact, and I think it shocked that Labour government, because then we did start to have some of those conversations. We were reviled by a hell of a lot of people in the sort of more conservative part of the disability movement. You know, they used to say we were disgraceful and that we were giving disabled people a bad name and all of this kind of stuff. But, you know, you can sit in meetings and in back rooms for the rest of your life and not really get very far. And what we were doing was bringing it into the public gaze, into the public domain. This was very much about getting public support and being seen, being really visible, and not just, you know, the public were fed as a diet of images of disabled people that were tragic and pathetic, and the stuff they saw in the sort of charity appeals like Children in Need. And here's a bunch of disabled people that are, you know, very vocal and very angry, but also very articulate in stating our case. And so that was the new image that was being put out there about disabled people, and it worked. You know, sometimes I think I just need to raise my energy levels and just bring people back together. I think there's an appetite for direct action. It's been a very hard couple of years because quite a few of the people we had in the leadership have died. And, you know, and recently Mike Oliver died, you know, who was a huge supporter. And, you know, and Catherine Arignello, you know, you just feel like you're endlessly going to funerals, which, you know, we know is kind of part of the deal around disabled people who have got conditions or illnesses that, you know, potentially are life-limiting. But it doesn't make it any easier to bear. I'd like to, you know, get that up and running, and I've tried to, but it's like people are agreeing and then nothing happens. So I've kind of got to the point where I think it's going to have to be me putting myself on the line again. And I suppose it's all right, but theoretically, my belief is that it needs to be done by a new generation and the younger generations of disabled people. You know, it's not that I won't join in, but I think that unless you build a new leadership, which it felt like we had, but then sort of in the last 10 or 15 years, that leadership is not there. It's not there. And I mean, like, there is DPAC, but they... Well, okay. I mean, I'm going to be blunt about this and people will hate me, but I think their actions aren't effective, or I don't think they're... I'll tell you what they are good at. They're good at doing the research and they're good at speaking out, but they don't do the daring stuff, the direct action, the visual actions that we did that actually really, you know, that stopped the traffic, that stopped the cities, that got on the news. And the only time that a DPAC thing did get on the news was when they stormed into the chamber of the House of Commons, which was superb. And my heart, I was out of the country at the time, but I saw it on the news and my heart swelled and I thought, this is what's been missing. And, you know, instead of capitalising that and building on it, they just went back to business as usual after that. And yes, I absolutely think we need a new... era of direct action. I think this government has got away with far too much for far too long, you know. And one of the things that I think I can offer, I can put my body on the line, but I'm also a good strategist because, you know, we learn it through experience. And so I've got 100 ideas about demos and strategies and what we could do. I think the other thing is build up some more allies. So that's where Extinction Rebellion would come in, because we used to depend a lot on people to do stuff, actions. You know, we had to have the drivers that would do the transport, and, you know, we'd have to have the people that would carry stuff and all that, you know, a lot of those jobs that just had to be done. Police quite often used to home in on the people they saw as non-disabled because they just assumed for a long time they were the leaders, which in fact wasn't true, but that was their prejudice, you know, getting in the way of arresting the wrong people, really. I've been saying it for the last 4 or 5 years that we need, if we don't revive Dan, then we need something that's similar. We need direct action on these issues, and we need to make it, I mean, really pack a punch. Because it's horrible, it's horrific what is going on for disabled people. I think we haven't been under such sustained attack, you know, and because it feels like people are almost getting used to it, but it cannot be allowed. All these things were interconnected. I think that it was so important to actually, to work with people, to train people, to teach people that there had to be a different perspective, there had to be a new perspective, and that, you know, the medical model had nothing at all to offer. You know, and that's another thing that I think has been retrogressive and retrograde, is that all these conversations that are all about impairment, I mean, people have just gone back to the safe old, but irrelevant. I mean, you know, it might be relevant to them, and I mean, all right, have your consciousness raising groups, but this isn't the main thing. It's not the main deal, you know. There have always been small groups that kind of go away and discuss personal experience of whatever, but it's not the main political thing that we need at the moment. I mean, I think that we really do need political activism, and yeah, I mean, more consciousness about, more education about that, bringing back the social model into focus. You know, I wrote a short paper. I was asked to go and do something for Inclusion London a while ago, and I just wrote this thing saying it was called In Defence of the Social Model, because everybody started hammering the social model of disability and saying, oh, well, it doesn't deal with X or Y. And I said, well, the reason it doesn't deal with it is because that's not what it's for. You know, and people think it needs to explain their personal impairment stuff, and it doesn't. That's not, you know, it's a model of analysis. It's a tool for analysis. And I really see it very much as something that, that I mean, as soon as people get it, they really get it. And it's a fairly straightforward idea to grasp. And maybe we have lost that a little bit. So I think we need to get more activism, but I think we need to get radical activism. I think we need to be getting people together. And, you know, and I guess if nobody else is doing it, then we will pull together a group of people and do it. Dan was very sort of wide-ranging in who came along. You know, there were people from, I mean, every impairment group. You know, we had people with learning difficulties really liked it because they were just welcomed in. You know, it wasn't about, oh, well, you've got to be from this, you know, to have this type of impairment to participate. It was, you're welcome. If you want to come along and be part of this, absolutely, please come. I think that for young people to always question, I think it's the number one rule as you go through life, and especially as you're young. You know, don't take as a given what everybody tells you. Always question. I think, you know, for us it was always questioning the assumptions about what life is like as a disabled person, because we actually questioned it and contradicted it. And I think for young disabled people it is always about, there are so many things that you are able to do, but you have to learn how to challenge discrimination, and you're much more effective challenging it when you do it together than if you do it individually. And legally, the legal situation is so weak at the moment. You know, we've had, I mean, you know, Jane Campbell's House of Lords report that a couple of years ago that more or less said the Equality Act just isn't picking up on the discrimination that disabled people are experiencing. So I think that we need to start, you know, young disabled people need to start organising. They need to start thinking about what are the main issues. I think it is always important to have a focus. It can't be everything. We know that it's just about every area of our lives that is affected, but pick a focus. What's the thing that is most important? Campaign around that. And there are lots of us around that will support that and help out and actually, you know, support you with the leadership and the development of that leadership.